y'all get my 6. Let me find this here mailbox. Hold on now. There's the mailbox. There's the mailbox. Yeah. Broke him out again, guys. Listen, here's what's going on today. Get my 6. Sun's starting to go down back there. Watch for movement, listen for tree knocks or anything else. Guys, I'm going to do something today that we're going to be doing often in October. I'm not going to be doing it every day in October, but I am going to do it several times throughout October. I'm going to start early today because it's, as of this recording, it's early September. But I'm very excited and I'm very thankful and I'm very grateful that my new book, October Nights, 31 Tales for the Halloween Season, is at number 1 and number 2, 2 different versions, print and ebook, for the best-selling newly released horror anthologies on Amazon. I'm going to read you right now one of the stories. See, I got my laptop here. I got it open. I'm setting it off to the side not to block your view while you watch for him, her, it, or they. So I just kind of want to give you a taste. So here's a free sample. If you like what you hear here, the book's available with the link below in the description box of this video, as well as, you know, all my other books. I just kind of want to say thanks. And I want to give you a free sample. I want to read you a story. And I won't be able to do it every night in October because not all the stories really are appropriate for this platform. Let me point something out right here. I'm a writer, and I'm pretty good at it. I used to not be, because I used to not write honestly. What I mean by that is, for instance, and people have complained about this, this is a pretty much PG-rated channel. I don't use foul language. There's been a couple of times when I've run face-to-face into what may or may not have been a Bigfoot Sasquatch on some of the night hunts I used to do, and one would kind of slip. But I don't talk like that in my daily life, and I certainly don't do it here. But people have read my books, and they've found that there is some foul language in my books. Here's why. People cuss. There are people out there that cuss. And I'll tell you, when I was in the Army, I used to do it a lot. Out there in the real world, these are real people, and that's really how they speak. So if you're going to write stories, full-length novels or short story collections like October Nights, and all your characters are PG rated, it's not very realistic. It's not very honest, and it's not very believable. So my characters in my books use foul language. I don't much at all, if ever, in my own life. But if I were to not put the real language of real people who are real characters in these stories into these books, I would not be a real writer. You know, oh no, what if, you know, so-and-so reads this and they kind of think very highly of me? You forget it. Forget it. Because if it's not real, it's not worth reading. So there might be, here on this channel, I don't think there's any in this story, and this is why I picked this story. But I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. You keep watching back there. This might take 20 minutes or so I might have to actually just stop to take a break. But you won't notice it. You might see like a little edit type thing or something, like just like a glitch. That's me just taking a break. So if you don't want to hear a story, just click away, you know. But if you want, here's your free sample, I guess, of October Nights. This one is for October 20. So we're jumping ahead towards the end of the month there. And this is a story called Murder by Mail. I wrote this story in my head in like 2 minutes when I was a mailman a couple years ago here in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it's crazy. Here's a story behind the story. There was this one street in Charlottesville where, aside from my wife, with her taken out of the scenario, the 3 most beautiful women in Charlottesville lived all on the same street. And it wasn't like this fancy, schmancy, rich neighborhood. And they weren't college students. They were in their mid to late 20s. And it wasn't close to the university, just on this one little street that took about 12 minutes to do the loop. And these are the things you notice when you're a mailman. You find that you start talking to yourself all the time. You just notice things. Gosh, plants, the trees, people's gardens. But on this one street, and I'm not trying to be inappropriate, there were just the three of the most beautiful women in this area lived on this one street. And they were all super nice. They'd give me water if it was hot. But one of them, her husband would always come to the door, and they were like 28 or 30 years old. And here I am, I'm pushing 50 now, but he would just stand there like this and just stare at me until I was gone. And that always made me think, like, may there be something going on no one knows about? And, it's like his wife's just out here being nice to me. I'm old enough to be her dad. She's just being nice to the mailman. Why is this guy taking such issue with this? So as I was walking back to my truck that day, I wrote this story in my head in 2 minutes. And then this summer, of course, I put it to word, and it's now part of the anthology. So with no further ado, it's called Murder by Mail. And let me tell you, this is fiction, okay? This is fiction. Murder by Mail. Mike the mailman walked up the courthouse steps, removing his cap as he did, ready to enter the building, admiring the beautiful autumn leaves twirling around each step. Little tornadoes of color, red, yellow, purple, and orange. Fall had always been Mike's favorite time of year. He'd learned, after delivering mail, mostly on foot, for more than 3 decades, to appreciate the cooler temperatures of fall after the blazing southern summers he'd endured. And since he'd only ever delivered mail in small, quaint communities, the blending of the fall colors on his daily routes made him feel as if he were truly living inside a Norman Rockwell painting. Hold on, I skipped down too much. After entering the building, Mike was guided into the courtroom by a bailiff. Mike had been 10 minutes early, as he'd learned to do back in his Army days, where he served for 4 years before dedicating his life to the U.S. Postal Service. He'd seen one tour in Nam while in the Army, and one tour to any third world country to fight people he didn't know for reasons he couldn't understand was enough for him, so he hadn't re-enlisted. However, Mike had always felt called to contribute and serve, and he felt that his long stint as a mail carrier had answered that call. "Will you state for our grand jury members your name?" the prosecutor said. "Mike Planters," he said. "And what is your occupation, Mr. Planters?" "I'm a mailman," Mike said, "and please just call me Mike." "With your permission," the prosecutor said, "and with respect." "Thanks," Mike said, thinking this guy should have been in sales, but heck, Mike had been around the block, thousands actually, and he knew all professions were sales. "How do you know the accused?" the prosecutor asked. "Missy Pale." "I've delivered mail at her place for the past couple of years," Mike said. "Well, she moved, of course, a couple months back. I still deliver to that house, but someone else is living there now, of course, after the murder and all." "Thank you," the prosecutor said. "And how often did you ever come into contact with Miss Pale?" "Oh, almost every day," Mike said. "She was one of my favorite customers. She was almost always home with her baby and all, and she spent a lot of time out in her yard, always working in her flower beds and in her garden in the spring. She's a real sweet kid." "Thank you," the prosecutor said. "I'd like to state for the record," he then said, facing the judge, "that Miss Pale is actually 28 years old. I know that that to Mr. Mike, that is very young, but the court needs to understand she was no child. She was fully an adult." "That's fine," said the judge. "Mike," the prosecutor said, facing his man on the witness stand again, "would you consider yourself a good judge of character?" "I would," Mike said. "I've been carrying the mail for 34 years, and I've come into contact with probably hundreds of thousands of people throughout the years, because I've carried the mail in 3 different cities, and I've met all types. You learn to read people when you do what I do." "How so?" the prosecutor said. "Well," Mike said, looking down and taking a second. Then he said, "You can tell a lot about a person's character based on how they treat people from whom they stand to gain nothing." There were light sounds of agreement from the grand jury members, an hum here, and a few "that's right" there, and even an amen from somewhere. The judge said nothing to admonish them, but he did give them a stern warning by way of a look. Miss Pale had nothing to gain from being nice to me, Mike continued. Shoot, if you knew how many people are out in their yards and then step inside or go around the corner when they see me coming just so they don't have to be inconvenienced with saying hi, it would blow your mind. Gasps from the grand jury and an even sterner look from the judge. If they kept this up, Mike was sure the judge would eventually give them a verbal warning. Miss Pale, when she'd see me, if it was hot, she'd run in the house and grab a glass of cold water and have it waiting on me. And she was always giving me snacks, and it was stuff she'd cooked or bake herself. I mean, she was a pure angel in every sense of the word. And what about her domestic partner, the prosecutor said, switching gears, the deceased Mr. Edward Given. Now, I'm not one to speak ill of the dead, Mike said, but I got to today. That man was no good, and he'd been tuning up on that girl for some time, and I'll tell you, I have suspicion he was on drugs, probably pills. And this is based on, the prosecutor asked, leaving it open. Well, again, Mike said, over 30 years carrying the mail, you see it all. You see the deals going on in broad daylight no one else see because they're not paying attention. Tunnel vision, I call it. If it don't happen right in front of them, they don't see it. You'd be surprised to see all the nonsense going on all around you every day if you simply looked left and looked right a time or two. Of course, I learned to do that in the infantry back in my Army days, and it kept me alive in Nam. Thank you for your service, one of the jury members said, a woman about 50 years old. She caught the words coming out of her mouth and quickly put her hand over her mouth and looked at the judge. The judge could see the fear in her eyes, and though he'd already opened his mouth, prepared to speak, he decided against it. This judge was good. He'd mastered the art of giving intimidating looks and stares, and he pulled out one of his best, and the woman almost started crying. She did not speak out of line again. Thank you, Mike said, facing the woman, happy the judge hadn't scolded her for having the audacity to be patriotic. Did you ever see any marks or bruises on Miss Pale, the prosecutor asked? Any physical evidence of your claim? Well, sure I did. And it was getting more and more regular there toward the end, before she left town and all. Left the state, according to her mail forwarding form she filled out. Looks like she went back to her parents' place up in Pennsylvania. That's correct, the prosecutor said. She's up in Pennsylvania. And of course, Mike said, that boyfriend of hers, that baby daddy the kids call him these days, who thought she was good enough to cook and clean for him, and I'm sure perform other wifely duties, but wasn't good enough to be asked for her hand in marriage. Well, I guess that was unfortunate. He passed on just a couple days after she left. He didn't pass away, the prosecutor said. He was shot in the face at point-blank range. Well, Mike said, I just didn't want to come across as graphic. That's why I even used the term other wifely duties instead of talking about sex. This drew chuckles from the grand jury, and the judge would have admonished them this time, but he was too busy giggling himself. He liked this Mike the mailman guy. He was folksy, the kind of guy you could sit on the porch with and have coffee with in the mornings, iced tea in the afternoon, and a beer in the evening, all in the same day too, the judge thought. If you ask me, Mike said, and I figure you're probably gonna, it's why you called me in here today, if you ask me, I'd say old boy had been making some deals that he hadn't been paying for, and the money collector had gotten tired of not collecting his money. I tell you, it's just my opinion, but I firmly believe the one you want for murdering this man is a drug-dealing scumbag that's still at large somewhere here in our community. Not some innocent single mother whose baby just became fatherless and who's 3 states away. Mike had said this last part with such force that it drew the man who'd shouted amen earlier to his feet to shout a lofty hear, hear. Silence from the grand jury, the judge said, finally getting vocal, and he'd steadied his hand over his gavel, letting the grand jury members know that if they kept it up, he'd pick that son of a gun up next. And if they kept going after that, he'd raise that sucker, and if push came to shove and they continued to disrespect his courtroom, he'd slam that sucker hard. He'd show them all those moms who always threatened to count to 3 and never made it past 2.5 had nothing on him. That's all I have, the prosecutor said, addressing Mike. Feel free to leave the stand, and you're welcome to stay if you'd like, or you can get back out on your route. Well, Mike said, rising, I'd like to know what's going to happen to Miss Pale, but I do need to finish my route. Have a seat, the prosecutor said, pointing with his open hand to the first row of seats in the gallery. Your Honor, he then said, facing the judge, and members of the grand jury, he said, facing the grand jury members, I'm a prosecuting attorney. It is my job to prosecute criminals. I know that Missy Pale committed no crime. In fact, I believe, after reviewing the investigator's notes, that Missy Pale was a victim of domestic abuse for some time, just as Mike the mailman stated today. I know that this does make her suspicious. It does give her motive. But Missy Pale had, indeed, moved to Pennsylvania 3 days before the murder. We checked her alibi and it fit. Therefore, I move to dismiss any and all charges against Missy Pale in the murder of her former domestic partner, Edward Given. Just as the judge began giving the grand jury their instructions, the appointed leader of the group, the foreman, looked at his peers and whispered, "Acquit?" And all of his peers whispered yes, and some gave thumbs up, and they all nodded their heads. "Judge," the foreman said, looking at the judge, "sorry to interrupt you, but we'd like to save us all the time. We're already in unanimous agreement to acquit this girl." "So be it," the judge said. "All current and future charges against Missy Christina Pale for the murder of one Edward Germain Given are hereby and fully dropped." And with that, he grabbed, lifted, and then pounded his gavel, and the jury members all watched him do it as if they were witnessing a living legend. The man had been county judge for nearly as long as Mike had been delivering mail, so it was fitting. Mike exited the courtroom and walked back down the steps, heading for his mail truck. The leaves were no longer swirling around in their little colorful tornadoes, but they looked beautiful, lying there still in their full autumn blaze anyway. Just like back in Little Rock, Mike said to himself aloud as he drove off, heading for his route. That beautiful young woman, he said, Janet, boy was she a looker. And that piece of crap husband of hers, always getting drunk and tuning up on her. Mike took a right and drove slowly into the next neighborhood in which he'd be delivering. I have never regretted shooting that son of a B-word. In Savannah, Mike said to himself, slinging mail into the first box on the street. Like anyone else who delivered mail for any considerable period of time, Mike had developed the habit of talking to himself during the day a long time ago. He was, however, sure to make sure that he wasn't saying the wrong things when people might be around listening, which was not the case here. So he said, "I'll never regret having slit that man's throat after the way he treated his girlfriend. I mean, she was beautiful." Mike completed his route for the day, and since the mail was light, he got finished at the regular time he usually did, despite having taken half an hour off his route to go to the courthouse. After taking his outgoing mail and telling the desk manager no, he would not go out and drop off a dozen packages that the handlers hadn't thrown into the route baskets on time that day, he walked out of the post office and he went home. "How'd it go at the courthouse today?" his wife asked after he'd gotten home. They'd been together for almost 30 years. Mike had met her on his route back in Savannah, Georgia, shortly after he'd become a mail character or a mail carrier. "Went great," he said, giving her a kiss on the forehead after he did. "They dropped all the charges against that poor girl." "And you think they suspect?" his wife said, leaving the question open, knowing that Mike knew exactly what she was getting at. "Nope," Mike said, "not any more than anyone has ever suspected anything in regard to that piece of crap you were married to when we first met." "You think they ever will?" she asked, concerned, but trying not to show it. "Nope," Mike said, walking to the refrigerator and pulling out a cold can of Coors Light and then cracking it open and taking a long swill. "How can you be so sure?" she said, walking up to him and lightly placing her right hand on his left arm. Mike shut the refrigerator and turned to his wife and he said, "Because everybody trusts the mailman." The end. So guys, there's your free sample, a short story, one of 31. There's 30 more, just as awesome as that, in October Nights. 31 tales for the Halloween season. I know it's early, but I wanted to thank you guys for making this thing go to number 1 and number 2. Number 1 in print, number 2 in ebook version. When October actually gets here in another month from now, as of this recording, we're going to do this more. We'll do this once or twice a week, and my plan is to have a campfire and do it by the campfire. But you're going to have to watch my 6. You're going to have to get my 6 because I can't be reading and looking for him, her, it, or they at the same time. So you got to keep looking for him, her, it, or they for me, okay? As always, thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for giving me an audience, which has re-sparked my writing career in such a way that it's like a fantasy. I can't thank you enough. We'll see you for more next time. From here at the PBS, the Potential Bigfoot Sasquatch Show.